So students, we are going to continue with Goblin Market today, and we are going to first look at some key facts about the text, and then we are going to have a look at the plot summary, right? We are going to have an overview of what happens in the plot. So first of all, let's begin with key facts. As you know, the full title of the text is Goblin Market. There are no subtitles to it, right? So there's just the title Goblin Market. If you compare it with another text, say Frankenstein, where the title is Frankenstein and then there is a subtitle, right? So, but in this case, there is no subtitle. The entire title of the poem is Goblin Market. So it was written around 1859, right? So you have some context of when she wrote it, because I already told you in the previous lecture that between 1859 and 1870, C.G. Rossetti volunteered with the church penitentiary movement, and during her stay with the movement, she wrote this poem, and it was also published during her stay there. So it was published sometime around 1862, and as you already know, this is the Victorian period we are talking about, and the genre of the poem has often been classified as fairy tale. But then there are critics, there are researchers who will say that it's not just a fairy tale, and then there is more to it. And what more to it is there is something we are going to look at as we discuss the text. So another key fact is the setting of the text. So we know from reading the poem, and those of you who have read the poem must have noticed that the events of this poem take place at an unidentified rural and idyllic setting, and perhaps possibly in England, right? But what we surely know is that the place itself is unidentified. We do not know the name of the village, we do not know the name of the town or wherever it takes place, but we do have a hint that this place is rural and the setting is surely idyllic, right? Idyllic in the sense that it is surely not a city, it's surely not a big city, there's no din and bustle here, right? So it's probably a rustic setting where this poem takes place, where the events of this poem takes place. Now, a few more important facts before we look at the plot of the poem. So one of this is the climax, and as the climax of the poem, you'll see that one of the sisters, that is Lizzie, sets out to buy fruit from the dangerous goblin men, hoping it might save her sister, right? And the antagonist of this poem, if you were to point out at who in particular may be called the villains, because this is like I said already in the fairy tale tradition, as many scholars have argued, and within that tradition there is often the trope of the hero and the villain, and in this case the villain or the antagonists are quite easily it's very easy to point out who the villains are or the antagonists are, and they are surely the goblin men, right? And here they seem to exist only to destroy young women like Laura and Lizzie, perhaps. One more final important fact that one must keep in mind while reading the poem, or at least while criticizing and analyzing the poem, is the point of view, right? And the point of view of this poem is from the third person. It's written in the third person. Neither Laura or Lizzie, who are the protagonists of this text, who are the main characters, they are not the ones narrating the poem. Rather, the narrator is a third person, and but the narrator has access to Laura's and Lizzie's motivations and emotions, right? The narrator never shares the goblin's point of view. That too is very important. So we have a third person narrator who is aware, very much aware, and has access to Laura's and Lizzie's motivations and emotions, but at the same time the third person narrator does not have access to the point of view of the goblins, right? So this is also an important fact that you might want to keep in mind. Now, before I go on to talk about the plot of this text, one more important fact that I would like to share with you is that Goblin Market has been illustrated in a variety of ways, right? So when the poem was published, and it's a longish poem, as you already know, it's not a sonnet or it's not a short poem, basically. That's what I mean. It's a longish poem, and as such, but then again, keep in mind, when I say it's a longish poem, I do not mean that it's an epic. Epics are much longer, right? Paradise Lost has some 12 books. The same is the case with most other epics. So, however, with Goblin Market, it's surely not an epic, and it's surely not a short poem. It's a long poem, perhaps. That would be a good classification. Now, keep in mind that when the book was published during the Victorian period, and I have spoken about this in the previous lecture. So, if you don't have any recollection, or if you haven't listened to that lecture, go ahead and listen to it. That will give you more context about the point I am making now. So, I had mentioned in the previous lecture itself that Goblin Market was a text which was published in the form of a book, right? And it has been illustrated in a variety of ways. So, accompanying the poem, there were sketches, paintings, etc. Right? It was very well illustrated. So, several well-known illustrators have worked on Goblin Market. So there is Arthur Rackham, right? Who sketched the illustrations in 1933. Then there is a very famous adaptation by John Bolton, and this adaptation is again in the form of a comic book, right? It's not just a poem. It is obviously a poem, but then it has been adapted into a comic book. But the first illustrator, C.G. Rossetti's first illustrator, was her brother and collaborator, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And I have spoken about this in the previous lecture. I spoke about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and C.G. Rossetti's association with it. But more importantly, the fact that when the poem was first published in the form of a book, the poem was accompanied by illustrations made by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, C.G. Rossetti's brother. Alright, so now we are going to move on and talk about the plot summary. We're going to have an overview of what happens in the poem. So as we start reading the poem, we come to know that each morning and evening, young women hear the cry of the goblin men, who seductively describe the fruits they are selling. And these goblin men urge these young women whom they are trying to have as customers to come by, right? Come by within quotes. So one evening, two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, hear these goblin men call out while visiting a brook to draw water. So Laura and Lizzie have gone out to a brook trying to draw water from there and take back home, when they hear these goblins shouting or trying to sell, come by, come by. Alright, so the sisters grow fearful and crouch down to hide themselves. And Lizzie, remember the names and try to distinguish one from the other, because two have very different characters, and that is going to be an important aspect of this poem. So Lizzie wants Laura not to look and covers her own eyes for protection. But the incurably curious Laura, right? She's impeccable. She's too curious. Remember the age-old adage, curiosity killed the cat, right? So Laura is very curious, and she's impeccably, right? Impeccably curious she is. So while Lizzie covers her own eyes for protection, Laura looks directly at the goblins. And Laura describes the goblin men's odd movements and wonders where these fruits that they are selling might have grown, right? She tries to wonder as she stares at them directly, and as she is able to have a good glance, a good view at the fruits that they are selling, she begins wondering where these fruits might have come from. In the meantime, Lizzie, the sister who had hidden her eyes, covered her eyes, is steadfast, and she's very firm in her refusal to look, and warns Laura once again that the goblin men are not just fruit sellers. They actually mean to harm them, that is, harm the sisters. Okay, so Lizzie then puts her fingers in her ears to block the sound of the goblin's cries and runs away, leaving Laura on her own. Now, Laura, as you know, is the curious one, and Lizzie is the one who is aware, shall we say, of the dangers of staring at the goblins or of listening to the sounds of the goblins trying to sell fruit, right? Because she is aware, as you will later see, she is aware of how seductive these goblin men are and the fruits that they are selling can be, and this is why she has warned her sister Laura, right? Now Laura chooses to stay and watch the goblins. Like I told you, Lizzie put her fingers into her ears to block the sound of the goblins and ran away. But Laura, the more curious one, the impeccably curious one, decided to stay back and watch the goblins. Now let's try and see what Laura notices, because Lizzie at this point is gone and Laura has decided to stay back by the brook to observe, to shall we say, watch the goblins. So Laura notices that these goblin men share physical characteristics with animals, and a range of animals are named in the text, including doves, rats, wombats and cats. However, even though these goblin men share physical characteristics with animals, they very contradictorily, perhaps paradoxically, they have very kind and pleasant voices. Now obviously Laura is fascinated, right? As you might have already guessed, Laura is the one who is going to, if you see this in the structure of the original sin, and I'm hoping that all of you know what the original sin is at this point. If you don't, look it up on the internet. If you do not find it, you surely will, but even if you don't find it or if you don't understand it well enough, let me know. But look up the term original sin nonetheless. So as I was saying, if you see this from the structure of the original sin, those of you who already are aware of the original sin, you will probably be able to guess or probably be able to already anticipate that Laura is the one who is going to commit the sin, right? Or who is going to, say, fall in the trap, even if you don't want to see it from the perspective of the original sin, right? And what Lizzie will do is going to come later, so we are going to reserve that till we actually reach the point in the text where Lizzie becomes more important. So going back to what I was saying, the goblins have animal-like characteristics when it comes to their physical attributes. However, they strangely, very contradictorily, have very pleasant and kind voices. And Laura is fascinated by this, right? And she stretches her neck towards them so that she can hear them better, or whatever. Now the goblins, obviously, they have noticed Laura and they approach her and seem delighted to find her alone. Note this, make a note of the fact that the goblins are delighted to find Laura alone. So Laura, who had been warned, remember, by Lizzie that these men are seductive and they only mean harm, despite the warnings from her sister, Laura wants to buy their fruit, but she has no money to offer in exchange, because the fruits look very enticing and she actually wants to have those fruit, to eat those fruits. However, she does not have any money to exchange the fruits with. Now the goblins make an interesting proposal. They say that if you give us a lock of your hair, then we won't take money from you and we will still give you the fruit. So Laura agrees, and remember this moment that this is the moment which I compared to the original sin committed by Eve, right? Eve eating the apple from the forbidden tree, that is the original sin. I have said it, right? So those of you who did not know it, get the clue from here, but still look it up, try and understand it better. So similarly, just like Eve was seduced by the serpent, Satan in the form of the serpent, and ate the fruit from the forbidden tree, similarly, despite warnings from her sister, Laura goes ahead and eats the fruit anyway. And after gorging herself, Laura gathers up a fruit pit and, in a state of bewilderment, returns home to find her sister waiting up for her. right? So after having this fruit, she suddenly goes through a very, a state of trance, perhaps we can say, because she is bewildered. And there are critics who have pointed out that the fact that Laura, after eating the fruit, suddenly finds herself in a state of bewilderment is a reference to the fact that during the Victorian period, the use of drugs was increasing, and C.G. Rossetti might have wanted to comment on it. So there is a degree of scholarship. There are some researchers who have pointed this out, that by the act of eating that fruit, C.G. Rossetti is actually trying to comment on the fact that there was a great rise among the youth when it came to the usage of drugs, right? So this is also another interpretation that critics have made, which is why I mentioned, keep that in mind as well. So again, that comparison is similar or can be done with the original sin, right? And we will relate all of these together. We'll bring them all together as we progress with this text. So Lizzie scolds Laura. Now Laura has come back home, and Lizzie scolds her for staying out so late and reminds her of the fate of Genie. And now who's Genie? Genie is a young woman who, like Laura, had accepted the fruit from goblins. This was earlier. After eating the fruit, Genie was abandoned by the goblins, and she pined to have those fruits again, and she never did, and then she died. So Lizzie is reminding Laura of the fate that Genie suffered. And what is more interesting and eerie is the fact that in the place where Genie is buried now, in her grave, even flowers won't grow, right? So this is something that makes the poem more fairy tale like, right? And it increases the intrigue as to what will happen to Lizzie, right? What will happen to Laura? Because if Genie, a character who has eaten the fruit and then was abandoned by the goblins and finally died, and even flowers don't grow on her grave, the question at this point is, or the intrigue at this point is, what will happen to Laura, because she too has had the fruit from the goblins and she too found herself abandoned. Remember, she had the fruit and then suddenly she noticed that she's near a fruit pit and the goblins are nowhere to be seen. Keep that in mind. So a very important question at this point is, if Genie suffered the fate that I have already mentioned she did, what is going to happen to Laura? This is the intrigue. So Laura tries to assure her sister Lizzie, and she says, nothing's going to happen to me. Whatever happened to Genie might have happened to her, but nothing's going to happen to me, don't worry. Instead, she promises Lizzie to bring back fruit from the goblins for her to try, right? And Laura describes the fruit as otherworldly and unbelievably delicious. So the two sisters go to sleep that day, and the next evening, when Laura and Lizzie return to the brook to draw water, which is where the events began the previous day, because remember, they were both drawing water by a brook, which is when they heard the sound of goblins saying, come by, and advertising their fruit, right? So the goblin men are kind of salesmen, right? And so you may try and draw another lesson from here. And once again, some critics have pointed out this too, that goblin men could be equated with salesmen, which salesmen as a profession did not exist 300 years ago, right? It is a relatively recent profession, and it is during the Victorian times that this profession became very prominent, that there were a lot of salesmen around going to houses trying to sell stuff, right? So the goblin men might also be seen as salesmen who have sold something which is apparently beautiful and good, but then inside is perhaps not that good at all. So this is yet another layer to the text, and as you can see, this text is filled with or rather sandwiched with several layers. Okay, so now the first day's events are over, and we have moved into the next evening when Laura and Lizzie return to the brook to draw water. So Laura tries to delay their departure. She wants to stay there for longer so that she can meet the goblins again, because enticed by the fruit she had yesterday, she wants to have the fruit again. And like she told her sister the previous day, she wants Lizzie to also taste the fruit, which is, in her own words, otherworldly. But even though she delayed her stay there, she could not hear their calls, right? And she is naturally distressed because she fears that she will never again eat the fruit from the goblins that she so dearly craves. So the two sisters return home that day, but there is a change in Laura's behavior from then on, right? They go to bed, and Laura kind of gnashes her teeth and weeps as she grieves for the fruit that she did not get today, right? So now days pass. Now again, cut to some days later. We know that days have passed, and Laura continues to pine for the fruit. Now pining means, when you feel sorrow for something that you don't get, that is pining. So Laura pines for the fruit. She listens. She keeps her ears on a very high alert, in the hopes of once more hearing the goblins. But she never again hears their cry. She never hears them shout, "Come by." In her despair, Laura's hair begins to turn grey, and she starts aging prematurely, right? She starts looking much older than she actually is. Now, one day she remembers the fruit pit she took back with her after first meeting the goblins. Remember the first day when she had the fruit, and suddenly she found herself near a fruit pit, and the goblins were nowhere to be seen. She remembers the fruit pit, and although she plants those seeds in a sunny spot and waters it with her tears, the plant never grows. So Laura becomes more and more restless. She refuses to perform her household duties or even to eat, right? So you can see a kind of sickness, a kind of malady has developed in her body. She does not want to eat. She does not do her duties, right? She has become extremely restless. And the once active Laura now spends her days sitting by the chimney nook, right? Perhaps in anticipation that she will be able to hear from the goblins again. Meanwhile, fearing that Laura will die, Lizzie resolves to find the goblins and purchase some fruit for her sister. So Lizzie, she knows that she will be putting herself in danger, but nevertheless, she puts a silver coin in her purse and goes to the brook at twilight. For the first time, that is Lizzie, actively listens and looks for the goblins. Remember, when they first came across the goblins, Lizzie had instructed or tried to convince Laura to not look at the goblins or to not hear them. In fact, if you remember, she had covered her eyes and put her fingers in her ears so that she would not be enticed by their seductive sound. So the goblins, meanwhile, are delighted to find Lizzie actively looking for them, right? Because the goblins, at this point, you probably have realized, are naturally happy to have a new victim, right? So they hug and caress her as they try to tempt her to eat their fruit. Now Lizzie tosses them a coin. She says, "I'm not going to eat your fruit, I just came to buy some fruit from you." But the goblins try to persuade her to stay and eat with them. So Lizzie refuses, saying she must return home to her sister, and asks for her penny back, the silver coin back, if they will not sell her fruit. Now, hearing this, the goblins become very furious and they literally begin to attack Lizzie, right? They call her proud and uncivil. They stamp on her feet, they scratch her, they pull her hair out, and they try to squeeze the fruit against her mouth to force her to eat it, right? So they have literally attacked her, they have literally molested her. Yet, despite the viciousness of the goblins' attack, Lizzie refuses to give in. Finally, the goblins realize that their efforts of trying to force this girl into eating their fruit are futile, and they toss back her penny before departing, leaving Lizzie alone with the fruit juices dripping down her face. Now, Lizzie returns home. She calls out to her sister and tells her to drink the juice from her face, because if you remember, they attacked her and they tried to force her to eat it, right? They squeezed the fruit against her, and her face, she was covered, Lizzie was entirely covered with the fruit, or the juices from the fruit. Now, Laura is horrified at first, fearing that Lizzie has eaten the fruit herself. Yet, as Laura begins to test the now bitter fruits or fruit juices, she behaves if she is possessed, right? As you can see her leaping, singing, tearing her robe, wringing her hands. Now, eventually, after eating the fruit from Lizzie's face, Laura loses consciousness and falls down, right? So Lizzie keeps watch over her throughout the night, checking her pulse and breathing, giving her water and fanning her to cool her down. Now, by the time Laura wakes at dawn, a transformation has taken place, a kind of metamorphosis has taken place, right? So Laura's youth has been restored, and at this point she embraces her sister. Now, finally, cut to many years later, decades later perhaps. Now, years later, when Laura and Lizzie have become mothers, they are now wives and mothers, Laura warns their children about the predatory goblin men and their dangerous fruit. More importantly, Laura shares the story of how her sister Lizzie braved the dangers that came with meeting the goblin men just to try and save her. So girls, that is very much the story of Goblin Market. Definitely read the poem. I'm sure many of you already have. Those of you who haven't, go ahead and read it. I'm going to stop this lecture here, and from the next lecture on Goblin Market, we're going to look at characters and other thematic elements, some of which I have already mentioned today while discussing the summary.